And so it goes. Children terrified as buildings collapse underneath them, old men dying in the blast, women clutching their babies, running through burnt-out buildings as aggressor drones aim their bombs at schools and hospitals. All victims of racial and religious and nationalistic passions, initiated by malevolent leaders. How many Guernicas must we suffer before we can stop genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes? 72 years ago, on the 9th of December 1948, in the shadow of the Holocaust and remembering its predecessor, the Armenian Genocide of 1915, the United Nations passed the Convention Against Genocide, an international treaty which made it a duty on all states to stop wars of racial and religious hatred. Yet still, they continued. Bangladesh, Srebrenica, Rwanda, Darfur, Yemen, Tigray, and the Rohingya in Burma. And this year, Nagorno-Karabakh, a war inflamed by some of the hatreds that produced the Armenian genocide over a century ago. I wrote a book a few years ago about the 1915 massacres. I called it An Inconvenient Genocide. Who now remembers the Armenians? And I called it inconvenient because, although it's a historical fact, it was so hard for political leaders in America and Britain to recognize it, because Turkey was in deep neuralgic denial and was, of course, an important NATO ally, which no one wanted to upset. But denial of genocide is a way of perpetrating and perpetuating genocide, and the wickedness of the Ottoman Empire in 1915 was seen over the sky, over the Artsakh Mountains in 2020. No death marches through the desert are not necessary these days, just a bolt from the blue targeted on civilian housing. Well, genocide is an international crime, which all states are under a duty to prevent and to punish. It's widely misunderstood. President Erdogan denied the Armenian genocide by claiming that it could not have occurred, because if it had, there'd be no Armenians left in Turkey. The answer to that, of course, is that genocide, as described in the Convention, is a lethal attack with the intention to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, or religious group. And the part may be as small as the Muslims in Srebrenica. What matters is that the poisonous hatred which festers and the form it takes by eliminating homes and land and memory and culture. In parts of Karabakh today, they're changing the names of streets from Armenian names to Azeri names, and that's clear evidence, an example of genocidal intent. Well, a genocide is usually inconvenient, especially for those countries allied with the country committing it. Today, you're going to be discussing ways of preventing genocide, and ethnic cleansing and war crimes, we have international laws against them, but we don't have enough will to enforce those laws. That is the role of the International Criminal Court, but too few countries have ratified its statute. So let me welcome you all to this year's global commemoration of December the 9th, with a sad acknowledgement of all the victims of genocide and other bestial crimes that you will hear about, which are called crimes against humanity because the very fact that human beings can conceive and commit them lowers and demeans us all as members of the human race. They are committed by individuals, most seriously by political and military leaders, who rouse nationalist and racist passions that drive their soldiers to slaughter innocent civilians and to torture prisoners of war. The global community, once free of COVID, must work out how to prevent and punish this murderous cruelty.
I'm Wendy Lauer. I'm the director of the Mgrublian Center at Claremont McKenna College and the John K. Roth Professor of History. And I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation today, and that's what it is. And it's a conversation that's been motivated by concern as well as celebration, concern about emerging situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh, and all of you have worked in this field of genocide prevention and upholding humanitarian law and international conventions, and even working on the ground as Raees has been working with Rohingya and collecting testimony there. So this is a really important moment to pause and look more closely at what do we mean by ethnic cleansing and genocide. What are these terms? Why do they matter? How do they help us understand what's happening and how to respond, how to seek some sort of justice in terms of the crimes that are being committed in that region of Azerbaijan. And all of us, of course, are, we feel the echoes of history in this region in terms of the history of genocide against the Armenians. And there's a very, 100 years on, the echoes of that history are with us at this moment. And I'm absolutely delighted as well that we have a distinguished group who bring to this conversation academic understanding, religious, theological understanding, legal understanding, the rights of victims on the ground, the urgency of that. So I'm thrilled to have Sheila Paylan here, Kate Mackintosh, Stephen Smith, and Raees Tin Maung. And I think we're going to get started we're having a conversation. This is not a typical academic panel. Let's just talk about these terms and why we seem to get hung up on them by what they mean today and historically. And is that really where we want to be in our conversation as we look at the events in Artsakh today? So who wants to get started on their view of what ethnic cleansing is and where it applies or where it doesn't?
I'm Stephen Smith. I'm Executive Director of USC Shoah Foundation, also UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education. And I'm so glad that we have competent people on this call to talk about the legal aspects of this, because that is not my area of expertise. However, what I am really interested in is victims and what they experience and how they experience unfolding events. And I think if you put yourself in the place of a victim, Wendy, honestly, it doesn't really matter what the thing that's happening to you is called. The definition of it is not what's on your mind. What's on your mind is, how do I protect my family, my children, my home, my heritage, my language, my future, my past? How do I navigate this unfolding violence that's occurring all around me, which I, as a victim, feel with amplification that nobody else understands outside of my circumstance? Because we, those of us who are observing what's happening in, say, in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh right now, or to the Uyghur or to the Rohingya right now, we're standing on the outside looking in. We're not living the life of those individuals who are navigating not only the violence that they're experiencing, but the disempowerment and the dehumanization and the exclusion that they're experiencing, which puts them in the place where they know most about the consequences of the ideology or the activity of the political powers that be, or the military and the militia and whatever's happening. They know most about it because they're experiencing it, and they are the ones that have the least voice in the situation to alter the circumstances. So I always start from there and say, so what do we do about this situation? Not what do we call it? But obviously, as a genocide scholar, I do take an interest in that, which we'll come back to later.
I think to jump in, so Kate Mackintosh, I'm Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School. I think Stephen's absolutely right. And if we think about some of the mass atrocities that have taken place last century, like Cambodia, or the bulk of what happened in the former Yugoslavia, that has not met the legal definition of genocide, right? But no one would deny that those are terrible, terrible things that we want to prevent. I think that there is there's often a motivation to reach for the term genocide because of, well, for a number of reasons. Legally, it's understood that the qualification of genocide, or at least it's partially understood, that the qualification of genocide imposes some kind of obligation on states to act. So I remember this really clearly in the case of Darfur, that there was a lot of debate about calling that situation genocide, which the UN envoy did at the time. And there was some kind of tussle amongst the powerful states about using that term, because there was a feeling that to call it genocide would have meant that they were then obliged to take some kind of action. And that's, I mean, in Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, just to be nerdy for a second, states undertake both to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. So it's built on this idea of a responsibility to prevent genocide, that there's the legal argument, there's an obligation to act. So obviously, if you're in the middle of a situation in which you're being persecuted, if that can be characterized as genocide, the idea goes, it may mean that there's a kind of external assistance in the way that there isn't without it. But I think Stephen's absolutely right to say that that's probably the wrong way to look at things, because, as I said, there are so many terrible events that take place that don't meet the legal qualification of genocide, but which we should still, as an international community, be extremely concerned about preventing.
I would just add to that, yeah, I agree with everything Kate said, and Stephen as well. And that, the use of the term genocide, because it's so politically charged, can on the one hand be attention grabbing and also distracting, where you start finding states or perpetrators get bogged down in the nitty gritty of what makes a genocide, what doesn't, and completely losing sight of the fact that mass atrocities are being perpetrated. So it can help to avoid sometimes using the term genocide in the early stages of when an atrocity is being committed, so that it doesn't just sort of get people to back off and say, no, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And also, that's why I quite like the term ethnic cleansing, because it's kind of a catch-all that can fit whether it's a crime against humanity, a war crime, or genocide occurring. Of course, it has to be a case of ethnic cleansing where you're trying to sort of geographically homogenize an area with a certain ethnic group, but it's because it's not a crime per se. Of course, it has to be, there's an underlying crime behind it, but it gets the discussion sort of rolling in terms of the facts instead of what legal implications it could have later.
Ethnic cleansing, as you know, has a historical, as a term. We have various cases that we turn to try to understand these events. And first of all, there's a discussion, of course, over the term as far as its euphemistic veil, right, to cleanse. The Nazis talked about cleansing actions or pacification actions. And similarly, the Soviets and their population transfers of minorities. And this has been going on, obviously, going back to the Armenian genocide. We have forced population transfers that were part of the genocide. So it's a mechanism that's can occur in the context of a civil war or a international war, of the movement, forcible removal of populations from one area to another, in the effort of, as you said, Sheila, of homogenizing, and also in the name of a kind of national self-determination. And going back to the establishment of the Declaration of Human Rights in '48, and one of the issues that came up there in the discussion was, and forcefully argued by Eleanor Roosevelt, was, we have to uphold individual rights and not state rights. And so these are like state engineering operations that leave individual victims completely powerless. And I wonder, Raees, in your interactions with the Rohingya as being forcibly removed and deported and displaced, if that was understood on the ground, kind of what was happening to them in a kind of bigger picture of history, was there that kind of understanding, or they're just so bereft that this is not part of the discourse on the ground? I'm just curious.
So for my people, we've been through its successive waves of massacres, and we call it the slow genocide, as per a lot of human rights bodies. The question is it over? Is it still? What about the people that still remain? There are about 600,000 still that remain in Myanmar. They are under severe restrictions of movement, of healthcare, of education. Are they waiting for their extermination as well? Just like how other ethnicities are continued to be targeted. And the very fact that we are denied, forget about citizenship, just our name, the word Rohingya is like a taboo. It's never used. They say, who are the Rohingyas? We don't even know something like Rohingya that exists. We are labeled with a derogatory term as Kalar. Kalar is the equivalent of a nigger in Myanmar. So that's what we are. We are Kalar. We are, in social media, we are, we are insects that need to be exterminated. These are literal words that you can, if you dig a little deeper, it will all come out. So to come to what Sheila mentioned, and what Kate was mentioning about this, the Genocide Convention, and that it puts a state into a responsibility to act. As an activist, as a Rohingya myself, an activist who has been mobilizing to the best of my capability here in Ontario, in Quebec, Montreal, in other places in Canada. The fact of the matter is, locally or internationally, despite the fact that there is this awareness that we build and we mobilize, and despite the fact that the Canadian government declared this as a genocide, and so did some other governments, what was the action? What happened at the end? We witnessed the burning down of about 400 villages, 392 villages burned to the ground. My parents' villages were exterminated in 2012. They don't exist anymore. There's a whole bunch of IDP camps, which is equivalent to concentration camps. But yet there's these talks. There is a proceeding happening at International Court of Justice. But to prevent, like Stephen was saying, to the person on the ground, it's that individual's family, his mother, his daughter who was raped, his uncle who was slaughtered. And that's done, and he witnessed, or she witnessed, other villages going through the same thing helplessly. And God forbid, it may continue if no action is done at the end.
One of the things, Wendy, it's interesting that Raees is raising this about the Rohingya, because Raees and I were working together in Bangladesh to take the testimonies of Rohingya that had, recently in 2017 come over from Myanmar. And I was in the camp in Kutupalong talking with survivors. And it was very apparent to me on day 2, having interviewed about 10 people, that I was interviewing the survivors of genocide. It was plain as the day is long. So I got, and by the way, I arrived there, there's a little by the UNHCR. There's an area called the Waiting Center. I wish it was called the Welcome Center or something like that, but it wasn't. It's just a place where you come and you wait. And so there were people waiting there, and I had a little notepad, and I started writing down the names of the people and who was there and who wasn't there. And it was apparent to me in talking to the first about 8 or so people that they had lost 1.5 members of their families each. And that was just in the first 10 minutes of talking to people. Over the next 2 days, I talked to about 10 men who were part of the community, and the same pattern evolved. 1.5 members of the families of a random sample among 600,000 people. So immediately I'm thinking, okay, this is 100,000 deaths minimum if there's 600,000 people here. I then talked to them, and what I was hearing was, as listening to them and talking to them, it was very apparent to me I was talking to the survivors of genocide. I got back to the Shoah Foundation and I explained that to my colleagues. And if you go to the Shoah Foundation's archive today and you see the interviews of those 10 people, you'll see it's labeled anti-Rohingya violence. It doesn't say Rohingya genocide, because I lost the argument with my own organization, which I direct, because the argument was, well, unless it's defined as genocide by a court of law, it's not a genocide. So in our conversation, my colleague said to me, so how do you know this is a genocide? I said, well, imagine I go to Australia and it's this, the 18th century, and I see a kangaroo. I don't have a camera. I can't tell you what a kangaroo looks like. I said, when I see a kangaroo, I know a kangaroo when I see it, but it's very difficult to describe it to you unless you were there and you saw it too. If you'd sat in that tent with me and you talked to those men, we would be having a conversation about genocide, not a conversation about the definition of genocide. And I think we do have a responsibility, I think, as professionals, whether we're legal professionals or we're academicians and genocide scholars, to make sure that we're clear about what the definitions are, which is why I gave on that point, why it is called anti-Rohingya violence. I am absolutely certain when eventually this gets tried in a court of law, that when those testimonies get heard and the testimonies of thousands of others, and ultimately people, there is a prosecution, although I don't want to preempt the outcome of whatever that judicial process will be, I'll be very surprised if the crime of genocide does not stick, based on what I heard and learned. And so therefore, based on that, irrespective of what the final outcome is, ethnic cleansing or genocide or whatever it might be, I, as both an academician and as an activist, will treat it as such, irrespective of what people are calling it.
Sheila and Kate, I'm curious as to, given all your experience as legal advisors and working at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and you worked on the, Sheila, on the trials in Kampuchea against the Khmer Rouge. So you've interacted with perpetrators, with the genocidaires, with the ethnic cleansers. What did you learn from that experience in the courtroom in terms of your understanding of what it was and how it played out, how it occurred?
One thing that I think we tend to forget is that even perpetrators are human, and what happens in a crazy context of genocide is you have this mass hysteria of people who end up getting dragged into committing crimes or associated with committing crimes that they may otherwise not have committed. And I think one thing I learned the most from my time at the international courts and tribunals is that we can't lose sight of the humanity of also the crime committers. And once we see them more humanly and see that this kind of behavior lies in us dormant, that's when I think we can get a real grip on it. It is, of course, the victims come first. I get that, but demonizing perpetrators and not respecting the rights of the accused also has very important consequences if what we're really looking for is transitional justice, real accountability, and deterrence.
So the two situations that I'm most familiar with are Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, because I worked in Rwanda and in Bosnia, right just after the genocide and the war there. And I guess, when you arrive in a place like that as an outsider, the main question that you're asking yourself is like, how could this happen, right? How can it happen? Because as Sheila said, we're talking about human beings, like how could this event happen really? What actually happens in people's minds? And not just when I was working in the countries, but also working on the trials for both of those cases, I think it became clear to me, and I'd be interested to hear if Sheila had the same experience, that in both cases, in nearly every situation, the perpetrators were motivated by fear. So they are actually afraid. I mean, they have been made afraid. You know, they have been made afraid of that other group. So they feel that they're fighting for their own survival. So if you take Rwanda, you know, in Rwanda, you had these, I mean, there are political actors mobilizing this, right? So there are people with more strategic objectives in charge, but the average kind of perpetrator, and in this scale of crime, it's, you know, there are a lot of perpetrators. The average perpetrator was really fed to think that if the Tutsi come back, they're cleverer than us, they're going to take over, you know, the only way we can be safe is if we kill them all. And I saw also in trials in Yugoslavia that I remember it really struck me once. There was somebody who was, he wasn't actually the defendant, he was giving evidence, but he'd been part of the same group that had, you know, apparently committed these atrocities. And he said, for example, that they had been told that children would come with bombs disguised as sweets, you know, so they saw children as threats. They were told stories to make them think that they had to shoot at other people and kill others first. And that was very helpful to me in understanding how somebody could get to that point, you know, and that this dehumanization that Raees talked about, of course, is absolutely crucial, but there's a dehumanization, and I think there's often mixed with a kind of fear of this other, and that seems to be a crucial element in motivating people to cross this line, which we all feel that we would never cross. It seems completely inconceivable, but obviously, you know, we're all humans, so as Sheila said, it must exist in us somewhere.
Kate, I like what you're saying here, particularly because I'll just relate this to a case in Rwanda I looked at. I was looking at trying to see how testimony of perpetrators could help us understand mass killings in Rwanda. So we interviewed 5 perpetrators that participated in the Murambi massacre in Rwanda. And we took them to the site and interviewed them at the site. And this is part of the program at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. So I've just written, I can't claim to be a criminologist, and it'll be the only time I've ever published in a book about criminology. It's a book coming out called Why We Kill. And it looks at the transformation of those 5 individuals, none of whom were ideologues at all. They were just civilians. It was quite remarkable to see over a 3-day period how they transformed from being regular civilians who were feeding the rabbit in the backyard of their little house with the neighbor's child, and then 3 days later killing the child, and the rabbit of course survived. Or another one where one of the perpetrators was going to the fence of the school at Murambi, where, you know, the Tutsi had been asked to congregate, and taking water and food and passing it through the fence, and then 3 days later was on the same site killing. And just looking at the transformation of those individuals, I think it goes to Sheila's point that they're just ordinary human beings that got, you know, whether for fear or whether for, you know, persuasion, or whether for being part of whatever they felt was right, the point at which they were persuaded, made this transformation from being, you know, fathers and parents and you know, regular civilians into being killers. And it was quite chilling, actually, to be close to that transformation.
I'd like to, thank you very much. I'd like to move the conversation in a direction that we're inching towards at the moment, and that is international response, institutional kind of response, international intervention. When you walk into the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you immediately see engraved on the wall a quote from the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, "You are my witness." So we're witnessing, right? And we're sitting here having this conversation, and we are witnesses to conflicts and genocidal violence that may be occurring at this very moment, but we haven't actually seen it, right? Or we haven't gotten reports of, you know, what is the information that we're getting on these events. So how do we, as witnesses, as bystanders, observers, near and far, how do we get more information about these events? For instance, in Nagorno-Karabakh, how do we respond to them? What are the mechanisms that are available to us besides these, as Raees was saying, and so sometimes there's a lot of talk but not enough action. What can we do? What tools are available to us right now?
I'll just respond very briefly to your point about being a witness. You know, being a witness is really easy because, you know, we can look back at what's occurred and we can try to make sense of what's occurred in the past. Actually, being a witness does not, in and of itself, mean that you become either an activist or a protector of others. And I think becoming a witness in the moment as history is unfolding is an extremely difficult thing to do, because almost invariably these events are taking place in territories that we don't know very well, to people whose culture and history and language we don't know very well, whose conflict doesn't affect our daily lives. And so being, you know, to use Helen Fine's term of, you know, extending the universe of moral responsibility is actually really difficult to say. It's not about me, it's about seeing myself in their shoes and being willing to participate at this moment is really difficult to do, including for professionals and policymakers and activists, as well as it is for the general population. So I think bridging that, Wendy, is the thing that I find to this day the most difficult, personally, professionally, and more broadly. How do you activate when it always seems unbelievable that these events could be unfolding, because they don't make any real sense. They don't make sense. Why would you, persecute a group of people that have a name like the Uyghur, which is difficult to even read if you've never actually seen that term and don't know what it is and you're a member of the public, let alone get into the culture and the sense of who these people are? And then why would China do that? And is it really believable? And it takes literally years for that narrative to become part of our narrative in the collective conscience. And by which time then, 2 or 3 years has gone by of this mass persecution of a group of people. So I think it's really difficult to activate from being a witness of the past to being an activist in the present. And I don't think we've learned to bridge that yet.
I'd be really interesting to hear what Raees has to say, actually, because I feel like we're talking as outsiders about a situation. And I know you're in Canada, Raees, but I assume you're closely connected to what's happening, as you said, with your own people. I mean, what do you think about the witnessing? I mean, the important thing, right, would be to elevate the voices of the people concerned. As an outsider, what do you feel has been helpful, or has there been a helpful elevation of the Rohingya voices in the situation, which also is going on right now, right? We're right in the middle of this one.
So to me, the people who are doing the most, I mean, as an activist, I have who's connected, who is privileged to be connected to people on the grounds in the refugee camps through a small network of schools that we run, as well as in the villages in Rakhine through some schools as well. I would say amongst the people who do the most effective or the most noble work are people in inter-ethnic and inter-religious bridging. Because this grassroots work, it may not give you results tomorrow, right away, but this goes a long way into developing a society that is much more tolerable and acceptable of the other, as opposed to demonizing or having at least just this othering thought, which gradually develops into this demonizing action with the catalyst of fear, as you said, Kate. So this ground level work, which comes at a great cost, especially in Myanmar, because I know some Bamar, some Karen, some Kashin, other ethnic minorities who are engaged, as well as some Rohingya who are engaged in this inter-religious and inter-ethnic bridging, not just dialogue, but actual events and activities, they risk it at their lives, at the cost of their lives. There are people who get arrested, tortured, and they're disappeared. They're gone just because they were doing something along those lines. But that's where grassroots change needs to happen, and that's where it's going to happen. And over here in Canada, for example, for an outsider, including myself, I'm not so privileged to be there on the grounds. I wish I was. But even as an outsider over here, I see really strong value in the work that that the Montreal Museum, Cost Museum is doing, along with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, for example. Just like Stephen, along the same lines of education of genocide. They're trying to push it into school curriculum, into activities for children, and that goes a long way into developing that awareness that this is a reality, and we have to know this reality so that it doesn't happen again, so that we live in a world, hopefully one day, where we don't see atrocities like how we're seeing today in China or in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Yeah.
I think one of the, I want to second what Raees is just saying there, Wendy. The most impressive thing to me, being in Kutupalong in Bangladesh and seeing that the response to the refugees was the response of the local Bangladeshi community. The wells that were getting dug in that refugee camp were paid for by local NGOs, Bangladeshi NGOs, money raised in Bangladesh to support the refugees coming in. There was a gentleman showed up at the food center, and I was probably at that food center for half an hour just to understand it. Guy turns up in a pickup truck. He'd driven 8 hours through the night from a Christian church that had put together a collection, and he was going back and forward once a week with his pickup truck with food supplies to bring to the UN food center. Why was that man driving through the middle of the night to do that? And gathering food from his Bangladeshi church of Christians, or a minority in Bangladesh, to help Rohingya Muslims who are coming across the border. I have to say, it was so impressive. And puts to pale, I mean, knowing the resistance that I was seeing here in the US, even to think about the Rohingya or to recognize their plight. And there were these people who have very little doing a great deal. It was extremely impressive. And thank you for saying that, Raees. I think it was such an important part of this conversation.
I think that when it comes to lending humanitarian aid and assistance, that tends to be relatively easy to garner support for. But when it comes to seeking accountability for crimes, it's a much more difficult process. And at least with respect to what's going on right now in Artsakh, ongoing war crimes being committed, ongoing atrocities that are emerging, at least, from what I can see in the news, and people feel really, really helpless and very abandoned on these issues. So I think what I realized was, like, it's one thing to raise awareness. That's definitely something that we all have to do. And when it's a cause that touches you true to your heart, that's what your first instinct. But also to be self-aware, because as soon as the situation calms down, or it's no longer your issue that's on the table, we tend to forget about other people's plights and just focus on our own. Or we have this way of I think, thinking that someone else is taking care of it, a diffusion of responsibility. And I think it would be a really good practice for people to also just look internally and see, how involved am I in problems that don't affect me personally or directly. And I think there's a lot of room for change there.
Could I ask Kate or Sheila to just talk to a minute about how do we end impunity around these types of crimes? It seems to me that as they're unfolding, whether we're talking about Artsakh right now or Xinjiang province and Myanmar, there is this ongoing crimes being committed that at the moment there is no judicial process for, but there is the opportunity to document or to highlight or shine. How do we do that effectively?
Well, kind of an optimist, actually, Stephen, with regard to that. I mean, obviously, there are crimes going on with impunity as we speak. But if you cast your mind back, I mean, I just remember, I started working at the Yugoslavia Tribunal in 1998. So it had already been established for 5 years. But when I was studying, there was no accountability mechanism, right? I mean, we used to have conversations. You'd study international human rights law, and it's like, how is this implemented? And well, there's a committee, and it like makes recommendations, and you're all like, all right, that's useful. And then there was this miraculous kind of coming together, this miraculous alignment of the global order, which allowed for the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals to be created in the middle of the 90s, in the middle of the conflict in the case of the ICTY, and then, which led, I believe, to the establishment of the International Criminal Court and so on. And even though I think we're no longer in that sort of heady atmosphere of optimism about, global accountability, and of course, the International Criminal Court is struggling, I still feel that has been such a spectacular leap forward and such a huge shift that now, I mean, even the fact that when we hear about these situations now, the issue of accountability is immediately on the table. Even if there isn't accountability, there are questions about accountability and how is there going to be accountability? And that just simply wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago. And I think there's all sorts of things going on in national fora as an effect of these international developments. I mean, we were speaking recently to Tin Kun, who's in London with the Rohingya organisation, who has started a case in a German court under universal jurisdiction, is making a claim about the Rohingya genocide. Universal jurisdiction is absolutely exploded. I have a colleague of mine who researches that, actually. So war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity cases being litigated in national courts in a way that they just weren't. Nothing was happening 20 years ago. And there's a sense that that's diminished in a way, but according to the research of my colleague, that's not true. Particularly in places like Latin America, universal jurisdiction is alive and well. So cases are being tried, just to be clear what I mean by that. You have a victim, for example, in a third country who is then, that country's prosecution system is then investigating and trying a case that happened in a different country, because these international crimes can be tried anywhere. So I think there is a gradual increase of accountability. I think the public's expectation for accountability has been raised massively. We see, I mean, in the case of Myanmar, of course, there was a commission of inquiry. These commissions of inquiry are very useful. We've had these independent mechanisms now being set up to gather evidence in the case of Syria, in the case of Myanmar, in the case of Daesh, who are gathering evidence and preparing indictments for eventual prosecutions, whether those are going to be domestic, under universal jurisdiction or otherwise, or whether there's going to be some kind of international jurisdiction. So yeah, I'm pretty optimistic actually about the progress that's being made in terms of accountability and rolling back impunity.
Yeah, and I think that the move away from the internationalization of prosecutions of international crimes towards domestic fora is actually really fabulous and should be supported, of course, with international assistance, because these are international crimes, and especially with experts who have knowledge of how to prosecute these things. But keeping them close to home is one of the best ways to ensure that there is real closure for victims, and that reparations can, even just when I worked at the ICTR at the Rwanda Tribunal in The Hague, the public gallery was usually empty. I mean, we would hold these incredibly important trials with some of the highest, most responsible people, and nobody really could see it. And then in Cambodia, the gallery was full every day, every day. It's such an important part of the process. So I am happy to see that trend towards domestication of international criminal prosecution.
I was in Phnom Penh when the the case that was, successfully tried in Cambodia was when the verdict was handed out, and I was in that room with all of those survivors. It was the most remarkable experience to hear the gasp, because I think none of them really believed that the trial would result in a conviction, and just that kind of moment of realizing that what they had experienced had successfully been tried and conviction had been carried was a remarkable experience. But Raees, maybe you could just share a little bit about the progress with the testimonies that you took in of Rohingya in Myanmar, and how they're now being used 3 years later. Because I think part of my question is, Kate and Sheila, is how can organizations like the ones that Raees and I work with help in the documentation and the, right now what's happening in Artsakh? I don't know at the moment how that's being documented, for example. How can we help in order to provide it? Because Raees might give some insights into what we did and where it's got to. Could be interesting to hear.
Absolutely, Stephen. So I was very privileged to be able to volunteer with the USC Shoah Foundation in the refugee camps. I spent 1 month in there, and we did some collection of testimonies from about 100 survivors through a small team that the Shoah Foundation organized. A lot of it got, some of it actually got extended to longer interviews, which were continued later after I left, and it has got a lot of attention not only from the UN's independent mechanism for Myanmar that I just corresponded with, and they are interested in utilizing those testimonies for their upcoming court proceedings at the International Criminal Court. But also, as a matter of fact, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, they were looking at it. I remember when we were working on our exhibit at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So that resource that the USC Shoah Foundation put together is an incredible resource for all human rights organizations alike. Let it be for prosecution purposes, let it be for education purposes, and I think this kind of effort is very required and very needed, valuable in any place where mass atrocities are taking place or have taken place, and they can be documented so that it could be utilized for educational purposes and for criminal prosecution purposes.
I think it's really valuable to take those testimonies and to document them. I mean, it's interesting to think about how a prosecutor would use them, if that was your question, Stephen, because of course it would be unlikely that they could admit something like that as evidence directly in court. I mean, it depends on the rules of evidence in that particular court, but generally, of course, you would have to have, the witness would have to be clearly identified by the prosecutor, not by a third party, whether or not hearsay evidence is allowed and so on. So what that would probably, in an international court, these sort of, at least compilations of these kind of testimonies, so reports that have been done by human rights organizations or commissions of inquiry or so, have sometimes been admitted as background information in order to show, for example, the scale of an attack. So if the prosecutor is alleging crimes against humanity, which means that there was a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, they will have to show that it was widespread or systematic. So that would require a massive amount of witness evidence. The way this is developed within the international courts often is that reports of organizations showing widespread or systematic attacks can be admitted along with a kind of more limited direct witness testimony about what happened, because it would be impossible for the court to hear 200 witnesses explain what had happened. So I think that's the way these kind of testimonies usually play into criminal proceedings, and they've been really important in that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great observation, Kate, and thank you so much for volunteering for the next program that we do to advise us on this. Actually, we went into this and we were talking to a number of colleagues who had been, like yourselves, involved in the criminal tribunals, and we didn't get really good advice, actually, I have to say. Not that they were not sophisticated people, but every situation is different, and so it was like, you got to get on the ground and find out, first of all, what are you discovering. So Actually, the 100 testimonies that Raees mentions are not in the public domain right now. And we purposefully did not put them into the public domain because we wanted to, first of all, assure the witnesses that they could be confidential in what they said, and also not make them part of a public narrative. So we have a very small selection of about 10 or 11 that are public, but the other 96 or whatever it was are actually for the purposes of research and further investigation. We realized that we couldn't admit them into evidence, but we wanted them to be able to support the process in some way, and to have content that was collected in a timely way, in other words, as close to the events as possible. We also, as Raees will remember, we wanted to have people who had eyewitness experiences in each of the 3 main provinces in the Rakhine state, because what we were trying to establish was this widespread, was it coordinated, and did it all happen at the same time? And what happened was we were able to establish that very quickly, that they all talked about the similar kinds of events taking place at the same time across all three of the townships. Yeah, so it was an extremely productive activity. But I think we as documentarians are really interested in how can we help the lawyers and the legal processes as best possible, because actually that's what serves the interests of the victims ultimately. So it's not about, in fact, our program is never about advocacy. It's about documentation. It's not about journalism. It's about making sure that the facts are as near as best possible documented by those who saw it. So I think this conversation, Wendy, that you've put together is really interesting, having Sheila and Kate kind of coming from the angle of what happens in the tribunals and how do you actually get the ethnic cleansing, well, actually the crime of genocide or crimes against humanity to stick ultimately in an unfolding situation like we're seeing in Artsakh and in Xinjiang, where at the moment it's nowhere near being prosecuted, but the events are unfolding. And so our question would be, so what do we do about that? How do we collect that information in a timely way that ultimately can help prosecute those crimes?
I think the importance, where there's a consensus here of getting the information as close to the occurrence of events as possible. I mean, having that reporting on the ground and that access to what's happening and that interaction with the victims who are, either in flight or you're on the scene, and that's just, collecting testimony after the fact. I'm sure, Raees, we get the truth comes out, right? The truth that the genocidaires or the so-called cleansers want to repress or obfuscate or distort. So in the case of Artsakh right now, what do we have on the ground there? Because we can't respond unless we know exactly what's going on, and to the moment, right? Not after the fact. Or we're great at coming into the relief efforts, and they're brave and noble and necessary, but prevention starts with before it happens, right? Before the killing starts. So what can we do in the case of Artsakh? Sheila, have you been connecting with people on the ground? Where are the best outlets for finding information that are reliable? How can we encourage organizations, or whether they're journalists or relief organizations, to get on site there and be part of the scene to tell us what's going on in a direct way?
So the human rights ombudsman of Armenia and Artsakh are they're working around the clock constantly, and they issue reports with the evidence, and they send them to evidence of atrocities, evidence of use of cluster munitions. There are, I think at present, probably 6 or 7 reports that are, not all of them are published because some are too graphic in nature, and so they're confidential. But that information, I think, is being mostly centralized within the Human Rights Ombudsman's offices. And then I'm aware of different endeavors to collect testimonies of incoming refugees at the moment. One thing that I think is really important, and I'm aware of different patches of groups of people doing it, but sort of the way it was very relevant to the Myanmar context is evidence is the nature of evidence is changing. And apart from witness testimonies, you've got the open source investigations. All the hatred that spewed on through official accounts of the highest ranking people in Azerbaijan or elsewhere, on Twitter, on Facebook, this evidence, if it's not collected and preserved right away, will disappear. And that's something that I think more and more people need to become experts in and well versed in and find, because eventually they'll need authentication before they can be presented before a court of law, but there are organizations that can take care of that. What concerns me more is if we wait too long and then someone realizes, oh, I shouldn't have posted that, and takes it down, and then it's lost, you know. So I think the centralization of the documentation is the most important priority right now. I'm not aware of where that's being done. I'm sure it is, but I personally don't know. And more resources, because I think that it's very time consuming to go through the internet and look for this sort of thing. It's much easier to take a witness statement. I mean, the witnesses will flock to you, or you know where they are, you know, you can go to them. As for international organizations going into Artsakh, as far as I know, it's very difficult for them to do it because it requires, many of them are unwilling to do it because it could mean recognizing the independence of this region, requiring the authorization of Azerbaijan to go in. So I don't think that they can go to Armenia, but for the most part, the information is being sent to them, you know, and the fact that this has happened in the context of a global pandemic, you don't have that many people flocking to Armenia at the moment, other than Armenians, of course, but so the information is being sent to them from various organizations. And we've seen, you know, Human Rights Watch recently condemned the brutal treatment of POWs. And so some people are reacting. But I would say, yeah, centralization of the documentation and trying to get up to speed on how to become really good open source investigators is a high priority right now.
The thing that always focuses my mind, Wendy, on these situations is, as the non-lawyer here, in the Genocide Convention, the word intent to destroy in whole or in part. And so what I always ask myself is, so what's the end game? I published this week an article about the Uyghur genocide, which is what I am now referring to it as, because it's very clear to me what the intent is. And we sort of use these euphemisms like cultural genocide, which I don't think is a term. It's just a euphemism for, you know, a different form of genocide, which ultimately, if the end game and the intent of the government concerned is the destruction in whole or in part of that population, then from that moment on, we treat it as genocide, whether it ultimately gets called that or not. And if you have to wait 35 years like Cambodia, we'll wait. That's not really what's important in the moment. What's important is establishing what's the intent, what's the end game, and what are we going to mitigate that and to highlight that. And I think all of these efforts need to focus around that. And I think somehow the definitional issue gets us a little entrapped because it then politicizes it. We need politics because the interventions that we need to make have to be political in nature. So that's, I think, why it always gets escalated. As a genocide scholar, I'm very reluctant to use the word genocide, I have to tell you, because otherwise it's like, oh God, they're rolling their eyes again. Of course, the UNESCO chair on genocide education is going to call it genocide. It's in his interest to keep his position going because we need another genocide every year, like. But actually, I'm extremely reluctant to do so unless it's very clear that the intent is there to decimate in whole or in part that population. As soon as you start to see signs of that, you have to act as early as possible and treat it as if it is the real thing, because ultimately it will become that. I'll just say one final thing about that. My instruction on this came from a book that I picked up in an antiquarian bookstore called The Yellow Spot, The Destruction of Germany's Jews. Picked it off the bookshelf. I didn't even open it. I bought it because it was obviously about the Holocaust. I paid my $10 and I took it home. I open it when I get home. Date of publication, 1936. The Yellow Spot, The Destruction of Germany's Jews. The authors of that 250-page volume drew the conclusion that based on what they were seeing in Germany at that time, there was only one outcome, and that is that the Jews of Germany would cease to exist. They didn't know gas chambers, they didn't know mass killing, the Einsatzgruppen didn't exist, Auschwitz didn't exist, Dachau had only been open a couple of years, but the only conclusion they could draw. And so that has become my sort of lightning rod for all of these circumstances. If I was in 1935 writing that book, what would I say about what the Jews of Germany were going through? And I see that written all over what we're seeing in Artsakh and what we're seeing in Xinjiang province and in Myanmar. And so we have to act as if it is it.
I agree with you. This perception of the powers that be, as it were. So the Azerbaijani government or the Nazi, German government, the Nazis in the 30s, for instance. What is their view in this book that many of you may be familiar with, by Alain Confino, A World Without Jews? When that state and the ideology of that state envisions the future, what is their future view? It's a future view that in which that population has disappeared or been removed or ultimately violently exterminated, physically destroyed. So that kind of perspective is, there is the intent, right? It may start with an imagination or a vision, but that's where things are moving. That's the direction where things are moving, whether they are forced to leave the region and relocate another place, a kind of ghettoization operation or reservation operation. And this seems to be what's unfolding right now in Artsakh. And I just want to move into some final thoughts here, all of you, as we close out this conversation. What do you think? What can we draw attention to there? What do you think our audiences can do at the end of this program to draw attention to events there and conversations like this that should be taking place in around the world and in other environments, and at the UN, at Human Rights Watch, and all these organizations that are monitoring and peacekeeping by mandate?
Maybe to answer your question in a very general way, I'm not sure how applicable this is to the current situation in Artsakh. I'm happy to talk about that as well. But I wanted to come back to the point that Raees made about the grassroots inter-ethnic organizations. I think all of us realize that by the time a genocide is actually happening, it's way too late. And then you get into these conversations about sort of military intervention and so on, which are very problematic. The obligation to prevent has to start way back. And I think this goes to what Stephen's saying as well. If it looks like something's happening, like that's the moment to name it and to do something. And what does that mean? I think as outsiders to a situation, what we can do is support local efforts at basically supporting human rights, right? And inter-ethnic dialogue if the issue is breaking down along ethnic lines. I mean, situations are only going to be solved domestically, ultimately. From outside, we can try and support, but we need to take our lead from what people on the ground who are resisting genocidal thinking are trying to do and what they think is necessary. So I think these sort of early warning mechanisms, I mean, the UN Secretary General has his special advisor, of course, for prevention of genocide, who monitors situations which look as if they might be going in that direction. I mean, there is a sort of early warning system around, I think, supporting human rights, supporting domestic human rights organisations in those contexts is massively important. And any way we can do that, I think, is the most effective kind of prevention we can do.
I have to say that I really appreciate also Raees's comment about the most effective efforts back home are the inter-ethnic and inter-religious groups that are trying to bridge those gaps. And I think that is something that's absolutely missing in the context of Artsakh, and usually also comes a little too late in the context of other conflicts, where we focus so much on punishing to fight impunity, of course, but punishment at the cost of reconciliation, punishment at the cost of actually bringing peace back to the communities. And there have been some examples where it might be better to let go of that idea and focus on forgiveness, truth, justice, reconciliation. Well, justice without impunity is a little odd, I suppose. But we can get creative, and if one thing doesn't work, it's not the end of it. If the most traditional way of rendering justice is not possible because of whatever political atmosphere we live in. There are so many other ways of making sure that this never happens again. And I think that applies both at the prevention stage and at the aftermath stage.
For those who are experiencing unfolding, mass violence, what they need to know is that people are hearing them, that they do not feel abandoned. There's very often we feel very powerless when we see these big international events. I think there's nothing I can do. You can actually do a lot for those who are going through this just by being present, just by listening, just by putting, something out that says, I care about this. And if you're an Armenian, take notice of what's happening to the Uyghurs. And if you're, if you're a member of the Jewish community, reach out who's in Myanmar and is a Muslim, and make those links and make it clear that we really do care for each other, because that actually is just half of the battle, and it means a great deal to those who are going through it when they feel and hear that you're present with them.
I just wanted to echo what Stephen said. It's absolutely crucial. As an activist here in Canada, working with the Armenian community as well. So thanks to thanks to Sheila, thanks to the organizers over here. But even in Canada, the Armenian community, we collaborate. I participate in their events, and it's very crucial that we collaborate. Just recently, we had the Holodomor commemoration for the Ukrainian community. It's very important that we all show solidarity, because yesterday it was them, today it is us, tomorrow it could be somebody else. And not only, I would extend this a little further, not only participate and show solidarity, but also take that one step further to engage our policymakers to act. It is very crucial that they act. And if they cannot act through intervention, that's very essential in order to stop it at the time when it's happening. The least we can do is have some kind of economic intervention, for example. In the case of Myanmar, I know for a fact that there are companies that are directly supporting, that have investments, foreign institutions that have investments that directly support the pockets of these generals. Genocide is, we all know, it's a profitable business. Every war is a profitable business. So if you follow the dollar path, it will take us somewhere. And if you cannot act, by military intervention, we could at least act through targeted sanctions on these companies that invest in Myanmar economic holdings. For example, I'm sure in the case of Azerbaijan and Armenia, or anywhere else for that fact of matter, there are, in the case of China, there are economic interests that we can target, and we should push our policymakers to get to those economic interests.
Thank you very much. I think you gave our audience a lot to think about, and also some tools, identified some tools of response. It's a multi-pronged approach. It starts with the victim and getting the truth out, but there are ways to dismantle these systems and to put pressure on those governments. And we have international and domestic mechanisms for that. And I, thank all of you for the work that you do in all these different realms. It takes solidarity. The Armenian cause is our cause. We have to take on everybody's cause. Prevention is our cause. It's a universal cause. And it's, sad that this situation, in terms of where we started, and we talk about ethnic cleansing, and that very language that we get mired in, this ethnic view of the world, and putting us all into these differentiating the beauty of that, but also the fact that it distances us from taking on each other's causes and understanding that we're all human, and that it's not an Armenian cause or a Jewish cause or a Uyghur cause. It's our cause. So I thank you for all the work you do in all these realms, because it really does take this kind of creative, multi-pronged approach to both identify it and prevent it and adjudicate these crimes. So thank you so much for coming to this Zoom discussion. With that, I'm going to close out our program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wendy.
Thank you.